When Jonah first saw her, he thought she was drunk or insane. A lone figure staggering through the high grass at sunset, her hair tangled, her steps uneven. Then he heard it. She was laughing. Not the laugh of a young woman fully alive, but the broken laugh of someone who had already lost everything. A tattered scrap of fabric barely clung to her shoulders, slipping with every step, and she clutched at it like it was the last fragment of herself she had left. Her skin was bruised, streaked with blood, her face pale as the dying sun sank low. It was the kind of sight that makes a man's blood run cold. Now, let me ask you this. If you had seen her there alone and broken on the plains, would you have turned away or stepped forward? Jonah Mercer was 52 years old, a man who had buried more years than he had left. He had endured drought, wildfire, and the slow passing of neighbors who abandoned their land. He thought he had witnessed everything the frontier could throw at a man, but nothing in his long, weathered life had prepared him for this. His horse snorted nervously as he left the trail and walked toward her. The closer he came, the more real it became. This wasn't a ghost or a vision from the whiskey bottle. This was flesh and blood. A young woman, no older than 25, who looked like she had crawled straight out of hell. Her bare feet were cut and torn, her arms scratched raw, and yet there was something worse than all her injuries. It was her eyes. They weren't pleading, they weren't angry, they were hollow, like the soul behind them had already slipped away. Jonah dropped to his knees in the dust as she stumbled against him. He steadied the cloth at her chest, his hands rough but trembling. That bitter laugh escaped her once more, soft and sharp, and then her voice broke through. She whispered that she was ruined, that no kindness could change that. And for the first time in years, Jonah Mercer couldn't find a single word to say. Jonah lifted her up like she weighed nothing at all. Truth was, she barely did. Just bones, bruises, and whatever strength kept her moving that last mile. He set her on his horse and led them slowly through the dusk back to the cabin he had built with his own hands many years ago. That little homestead was nothing fancy, just 4 walls of pine, a roof that leaked in the spring, and a fire that burned steady enough to keep a man alive. Tonight it had to keep her alive too. He laid her down in the small spare room. She didn't fight, didn't speak. She just stared at the ceiling as though she wasn't even in her own body anymore. Jonah brought her a plate of beans and bread, set it by the bed, and waited. She didn't touch it. He tried again the next morning, and the one after that. Same story. No words, no food, no spark in those eyes. Most men would have walked away, maybe even sent her back to town, saying she wasn't their concern. But Jonah wasn't most men. He did what old ranchers do best. He kept steady. Each day he cooked, left fresh water, folded a blanket at the foot of the bed. He even set one of his old shirts on the chair, the kind a working man wore until the fabric softened with sweat and sun. Maybe, he thought, the smell of a simple life, the smell of smoke, leather, and horse might remind her that not every man in the world meant harm. On the 3rd day something shifted. He entered quietly, as usual, and saw her shoulders wrapped in that old shirt. It hung loose on her frame, but she had chosen it. She had chosen not to stay buried in that filthy rag she had arrived in. Her hand trembled as she lifted a piece of bread, chewing slowly as if every bite cost her. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She told him her name was Lola. It wasn't much, just a name, but to Jonah, it was the first crack of light breaking through the dark. Well, let me ask you this. If a soul as broken as hers found the strength to speak again, wouldn't you stay to see what happens next? For a few days the homestead remained quiet. Jonah tended his chores. Lila kept mostly to herself, and the sun kept burning down on them as it always did. Life on the frontier doesn't slow just because one soul is hurting. Horses still need feeding, fences still need repairing, and dust never stops creeping in under the door. But in those quiet evenings, Jonah noticed something. Lila wasn't staring through him anymore. She was watching the way he chopped wood, tended the fire, poured coffee at dawn, like she was trying to remember what decent living looked like. That fragile peace broke late one afternoon. Jonah was bringing in water when he saw a rider slowly approaching the trail. Dust trailed behind the horse, and the rider's posture told Jonah trouble was near. The rider pulled up at the gate, scanning the homestead like it all belonged to him, then spat in the dirt. He wasn't from around here. His coat was too fine for a working man, and the way his eyes darted to the house told the story. He's come for her. Name's mine, the man said flatly. That girl inside, she doesn't belong here. She belongs back in Redstone. Jonah said nothing. He stood steady, one hand on the rail, the other near his Winchester leaning against the porch. The man dismounted, swaggered up a few steps and smirked. "You hiding her, old man? You think a dried-up rancher like you can keep what isn't yours?" Jonah finally spoke, his voice low but hard. "She belongs to no one." The rider laughed, a cruel, sharp sound, and took a step closer. That was when Jonah moved. In one motion, the Winchester was in his hands. The lever clicked. The barrel rose to meet the man's chest. Silence fell. Even the horse shifted nervously. Sensing the change in the air, the rider's grin faded. He wasn't expecting steel nerves from a man his age. All for a long moment they stared at each other, the wind tugging at their coats. Finally, the man cursed, backed away, and swung into the saddle. "This ain't over," he called bitterly. Then he turned and rode back down the trail, dust swirling behind him. Jonah lowered the rifle, his hands shaking, not from fear but from anger. Anger that a man thought he could claim another human being like property. He knew this wouldn't be the last visit, and Lila knew it too. She had been standing at the window pale and trembling, but in her eyes, for the first time, there was something else, a spark of belief that maybe, just maybe, someone would stand and fight for her. And here's the thing. Out here in the West, every man has to decide what line he's willing to draw. Jonah had drawn his. And if you believe no one should be treated like property, this is the kind of story you'll want to follow. The days after Branson rode away were heavy, but they were also different. The land by the creek had been claimed, a piece of Corbin's soul carved out and taken with it. Yet, in the quiet mornings when the first light kissed the rolling hills and the smell of coffee drifted from the cabin, he felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. Not the kind that comes from holding land, but the kind that comes from knowing you saved another life. Lila began to move around the ranch in small, careful steps. She swept the porch, fed the chickens, even laughed softly one evening when Corbin's old mule stubbornly refused to budge from the corral. Her laughter this time was different. Not hollow, not bitter, but the laughter of someone remembering she was alive. Corbin worked alongside her, mostly silent, but every silence held a quiet comfort. Sometimes they shared bread by the fire. Sometimes they sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the western hills, painting the sky red. No promises, no grand declarations, just the steady rhythm of two wounded souls finding a way to fit together. Lila still carried her scars, some visible on her skin, most hidden deep in her heart. But every time Corbin looked at her, he didn't see what she had been forced to endure. He saw the person standing before him, the one she was becoming. And perhaps that is what love truly is on the frontier, not flashy words or bells in a church, but choosing someone, day after day, to stay. Now, here's the question for you. If you encountered someone like Lila, someone the world had cast aside, someone carrying a past you could barely imagine, would you risk your most treasured possession to keep them safe? Or would you turn away, telling yourself it wasn't your fight? That is the line this story leaves us with. Corbin gave up a part of himself, not for what Lila had been, but for who she could still become. And that, my friends, is a lesson worth holding on to. Sometimes the hardest choice a person can make is also the one that preserves their soul. If this story moved you the way it moved me, take a moment. Hit the like button if it touched your heart. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what you would have done in Corbin's place. And make sure to subscribe, because out here on the frontier, the next story is always waiting just beyond the horizon.